For a series that meant so much to so many people, it's strange how quietly it disappeared. The Legacy of Kain was once one of the most ambitious storytelling franchises in gaming. It had layered characters, complicated timelines, and a world that felt darker and more philosophical than most games of its time. And yet, after Legacy of Kain Defiance, the series simply stopped. For years, fans wondered what happened, and eventually, we learned something surprising. The series almost came back in the form of a new game called Legacy of Kain: Dead Sun. But before we get to that story, it's worth remembering how the series got here in the first place. It all began in the late 1900s with Blood Omen: Legacy of Kain, developed by Silicon Knights. The game introduced players to Kain, a murdered nobleman resurrected as a vampire who sets out on a quest for revenge across the land of Nosgoth. What made Blood Omen stand out wasn't just its gothic atmosphere, it was the writing. The game was filled with long monologues, moral ambiguity, and a sense that the world itself was already doomed long before the player arrived. It felt more like a dark fantasy novel than a typical action game of that era. Despite critical praise, Blood Omen wasn't a massive commercial success, but the world it introduced had potential, and eventually the series continued in a different direction with Legacy of Kain: Soul Reaver. Soul Reaver shifted the perspective away from Kain and toward Raziel, one of his former lieutenants who returns from death seeking revenge. The change worked. Soul Reaver became the breakout success of the franchise, praised for its haunting atmosphere, its unique spectral realm mechanic, and its surprisingly complex story. It also ended on one of the most famous cliffhangers in gaming history. The sequel, Legacy of Kain: Soul Reaver 2, leaned even further into the series' tangled narrative. Time travel, destiny, paradoxes. By this point, the series had fully embraced its reputation as one of gaming's most intricate stories. At the same time, another branch of the series appeared in the form of Blood Omen 2. Blood Omen 2 remains one of the most divisive entries in the franchise. While some players appreciated its darker tone and the chance to play as Kain again, others felt its story didn't quite line up with the timeline established by the Soul Reaver games. Still, it kept the franchise alive. Finally, in 2003, the series reached what seemed like its conclusion, with Legacy of Kain: Defiance. Defiance allowed players to control both Kain and Raziel, as their story finally converged. It answered some of the long-standing questions, introduced new ones, and ended with Raziel making a sacrifice that seemed to complete his arc. But the story of Nosgoth wasn't entirely finished. Kain was left alive. The Elder God still existed. The world itself was still broken. It felt less like an ending and more like a pause, and then nothing happened. For years, the series went quiet. Fans continued discussing the lore and hoping for a continuation, but no new games appeared. Behind the scenes, however, something was happening. In the early 2010s, a new project began development under Crystal Dynamics and publisher Square Enix. That project was Legacy of Kain: Dead Sun. Unlike previous entries, Dead Sun was intended as a soft reboot, set in the same universe, but thousands of years after the original story. The game would introduce a new protagonist named Gain, in which a human named Asher, who was murdered, would be resurrected into the vampire's body. The idea was that Gain would hunt down his killer across Nosgoth, while slowly discovering the ancient history of the world. The game reportedly featured a darker, more grounded tone, and a combat system inspired by modern action games. But Dead Sun had another major component, a multiplayer mode tied to the world of Nosgoth. This eventually evolved into a separate online project known simply as Nosgoth, where players would battle as humans and vampires in team-based matches. Dead Sun itself, however, was struggling. Reports from developers suggested the project had gone through multiple design changes during development. Some of the original concepts were altered, and the connection to the classic characters of the series became less clear. There were also concerns from the publisher about whether a new Legacy of Kain game would sell well in the modern market. Eventually, after several years of development, the project was cancelled. When footage of the game leaked online years later, fans were finally able to see what Dead Sun might have looked like. The footage shows a dark, atmospheric world that clearly drew inspiration from the original series, but it also looked very different from the games fans remembered, and that difference may have been part of the problem. The Legacy of Kain series had always been known for its characters, Kain, Raziel, and the long, complicated story that tied everything together. Dead Sun seemed ready to move beyond those characters entirely. Whether that would have worked is something we'll probably never know. What we do know is that Dead Sun was cancelled, the multiplayer project Nosgoth eventually shut down, and the franchise returned to silence once again. Which brings us back to the present. More than 20 years after Defiance, the Legacy of Kain series still has a devoted fanbase. People continue discussing its story, replaying the games, and wondering whether Nosgoth will ever return. And yet, despite all of that silence over the years, the story of Legacy of Kain hasn't completely faded away. In fact, the franchise is currently experiencing something of a small resurgence. Recent years have seen renewed interest in Nosgoth, starting with the remastered releases of Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, and Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver 2, which have introduced a new generation of players to the series' haunting world and its famously intricate narrative. There's also a remaster of Legacy of Kain Defiance on the horizon, something longtime fans once thought might never happen. And perhaps most surprisingly of all, a brand new entry titled Legacy of Kain Ascendance is set to release on March 31st. It's developed by BitBoy Media and published by Crystal Dynamics. The game takes a retro-inspired 2D approach and will feature 4 playable characters, both the vampire and wraith forms of Raziel, alongside Kain and newcomer Elilith from the recent Dead Shall Rise comic. It may not be the full continuation of the saga many fans once imagined, but it does show that Nosgoth is far from forgotten. Legacy of Kain remains one of gaming's most fascinating unfinished stories, a series that pushed storytelling further than most games of its era, only to vanish before its world could truly reach a conclusion. And that's really the strange legacy of Legacy of Kain, a franchise that was once pushing storytelling in games further than most developers even attempted, only to quietly fade away. Maybe Legacy of Kain Dead Sun could have brought it back, or maybe it would have felt too different from the series people loved. After all, so much of what made those games special came from the characters and the writing that built up over time. What we're left with instead is a series that still sparks debate years later. Some people think it ended exactly where it needed to with Legacy of Kain Defiance. Others still feel there's one final chapter missing. So I'm curious, what do you think? Would you have wanted to see Dead Sun actually release? Or do you think the story of Kain and Raziel should have continued in a more traditional sequel instead? Let me know your memories of the series in the comments. I always enjoy hearing how other people first discovered these games, and whether they still hold up for you today. Thanks for watching.